Get him out of my boardroom. Emily Whitmore's voice was calm, but sharp enough to silence 12 executives around the polished walnut table. Every face turned toward Daniel Hayes. He stood near the glass doors with a battered toolbox in one hand, wearing faded work pants, scuffed boots, and a brown canvas jacket whose cuffs had been repaired more than once. At 32, Daniel had the angular face of a man who had learned to carry difficult years quietly, dark brown hair slightly disordered from the August heat, and the solid build of someone accustomed to fixing things with his own hands. Emily looked him over once. We have investors arriving in 20 minutes, and someone dressed like that is wandering through the executive floor. A few restrained laughs moved around the table. Daniel said nothing. Beyond the 42nd floor windows, Chicago glittered beneath the morning sun, while the silver Whitmore Technologies logo stretched across the wall behind Emily like a monument. Daniel's eyes rested on it for 1 second too long. He remembered when that logo had existed only as 3 crooked pencil lines on a diner napkin. I'm here about the presentation system, he said quietly. Engineering requested maintenance. Emily folded her arms. 28, blonde, polished, and already carrying the authority of a company worth billions, she had spent 3 years proving she could protect the empire her father left behind. Appearance mattered here. Precision mattered. Control mattered. And Daniel Hayes looked like none of those things. Maintenance has a service entrance. The problem isn't downstairs. Then where is it? Daniel glanced toward the enormous presentation screen. Inside the original architecture. Charles Grant, the company's CFO, gave a dry chuckle. And you know that from carrying a toolbox through the door? Another ripple of laughter followed. Daniel simply set the toolbox down. No anger. No embarrassment. No attempt to defend his clothes. That quietness irritated Emily more than an argument would have. Mr. Hayes, whatever your supervisor told you, this meeting involves people who expect professionalism. Daniel looked at the worn sleeve of his jacket, then back at her. Professionalism and expensive clothes aren't always the same thing. The room went still. Charles leaned forward. Careful. Daniel didn't flinch. I am. Emily stepped closer, heels clicking against the stone floor. You clearly don't understand where you are. For the first time, something changed in Daniel's expression. Not pride, not resentment. Something older. He looked past her toward a framed photograph of Richard Whitmore, her late father, hanging beside the boardroom doors. Then Daniel said, almost gently, your father never cared what I wore. Emily froze. Don't speak about my father. Daniel held her gaze for a quiet beat, then nodded. Understood. He reached for his toolbox. As he lifted it, something slipped from beneath his jacket and caught the morning light. A small brass key hung from an old leather cord around his neck. Daniel quickly tucked it away, but Emily had already seen the initials engraved into its worn surface. R.W. her father's initials. Daniel left the executive floor without another word. By the time the elevator doors closed, the polished glass, tailored suits, and carefully measured smiles disappeared behind him. He looked down at the brass key resting against his chest and slowly tucked it beneath his shirt. Richard Whitmore had given it to him 12 years earlier. Daniel had not worn it for sentiment. He wore it because some promises deserved to stay close. At 5:43 that evening, his old dark blue pickup rolled into the driveway of a modest brick house on the northwest side of Chicago. The truck had nearly 180,000 miles on it. The porch railing needed another coat of paint, and one kitchen window still refused to close properly whenever the weather turned humid. Daniel could have complained about any of it. He never did. Before he reached the front door, it swung open. Dad, you are late. Mia Hayes stood there with her hands planted on her hips, trying very hard to look disappointed. At 8 years old, she had already perfected 3 expressions Daniel could never resist. This was number 2. 14 minutes, Daniel said. 15. Traffic. Excuses. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Who taught you that word? You did. He smiled for the first time all day. Then I created my own problem. Mia hugged him around the waist, and whatever remained of the boardroom seemed to fall away. Inside, the house smelled of tomato soup and toasted bread. Daniel changed a loose cabinet hinge while Mia finished her homework at the kitchen table. He checked her spelling words, packed tomorrow's lunch, and listened seriously as she explained why Pluto deserved another chance at being a planet. This was the part of Daniel's life no executive at Whitmore Technologies ever saw. No boardroom. No title, no applause. Just a father keeping promises one ordinary evening at a time. Later, while searching a hallway closet for poster board, Mia pulled down an old cardboard box. Photographs spilled across the floor. Dad, Daniel stopped. Mia held up a faded picture. Two younger men stood inside a cluttered garage beside a crude metal prototype. One was unmistakably Daniel, thinner and smiling broadly. The other was Richard Whitmore. Behind them, written across a whiteboard, were the words Whitmore Systems, version 1. Mia looked from the photograph to her father. That is the man from your company. Daniel crouched beside her. Yes. Was he your boss? The question lingered in the quiet house. Daniel picked up the photograph carefully, his thumb brushing dust from one corner. For a moment, he could almost smell that old garage again. Burnt coffee, warm circuitry, machine oil. He could hear Richard laughing at another failed test and saying they would try again before sunrise. No, sweetheart, Daniel finally said. He was my friend. Mia frowned. Then why does nobody at the company know you? Daniel's smile faded. Some truths were difficult because they hurt. Others were difficult because telling them could change everything. Life happened, he said. Mia studied him with the simple honesty only children possessed. That is not really an answer. Daniel almost laughed. No, it is not. She turned the photograph over. Her expression changed. Dad, there is writing back here. Daniel went still. In Richard's unmistakable handwriting were 9 words Daniel had not read in more than a decade. Daniel, whatever happens, we built this together. Do not forget. Daniel did not sleep much that night. Long after Mia had gone to bed, he sat beneath the warm kitchen light with Richard's photograph resting beside an untouched cup of coffee. 12 years earlier, there had been no glass tower, no executive floor, no billion-dollar valuation. Whitmore Technologies had been 2 folding tables inside a rented garage outside Chicago, a second-hand soldering station, 3 aging computers, and a space heater that rattled whenever the temperature dropped below 30 degrees. Richard Whitmore had been 46 then, energetic, stubborn, and almost completely broke. Daniel was 20, younger than anyone trusted and talented enough to make that distrust inconvenient. Richard had the vision. Daniel knew how to make the vision work. Again, Richard would say whenever a prototype failed. We already tried it 3 times, Daniel would answer. Then the 4th time has excellent odds. Daniel would shake his head. Richard would pour terrible coffee, and they would keep working. Their first breakthrough came at 2:17 on a February morning when a system designed to coordinate industrial equipment finally completed a full test without crashing. No applause followed. No investors were watching. Only 2 exhausted men stared at a green light blinking steadily across a homemade control board. Richard whispered, "That little light just changed our lives." He was right. Within 18 months, Whitmore had contracts in 6 states. Within 3 years, the garage became an office, then another office, then an entire building. Yet Daniel never cared much about titles. Richard called himself founder because someone had to stand in front of cameras. Daniel preferred the engineering floor, where problems were honest and machines never cared what a man wore. Then Daniel's life changed. His wife became seriously ill shortly after Mia was born, and hospital visits replaced product meetings. Richard offered money, leave, anything Daniel needed. Daniel chose time. He stepped away from the company when it was beginning its fastest expansion because his family needed him more than a corporation did. What almost nobody knew was that Richard refused to accept Daniel's resignation as the end of their partnership. One rainy evening, he came to Daniel's house carrying a leather folder. "You built this beside me," Richard said. "I am not letting history turn you into an employee." Daniel had barely looked at the documents. His wife was sleeping in the next room. Mia was crying upstairs. Ownership percentages meant nothing to him that night. "Keep it safe," Richard told him. "Someday it may matter." That was the first truth Daniel had buried. The second was stranger. Richard had taken the leather folder back with him. Daniel never saw it again. 3 months later, Richard told him the arrangement had been secured privately and handed him only the small brass key engraved with his initials. "If the company ever forgets what it was built for," Richard had said, "this opens what they will need to remember." Daniel had assumed he meant documents. Now, sitting in the kitchen 12 years later, he was no longer certain. He turned the old photograph over again and noticed something Mia had missed. Beneath Richard's message, almost erased by age, was a tiny handwritten symbol, a circle crossed by two vertical lines. Daniel recognized it immediately. Richard used that mark only on confidential prototype files. The next morning, 42 floors above downtown Chicago, Charles Grant stood alone inside Richard Whitmore's preserved private office. He opened a locked drawer, removed an old envelope bearing that exact same symbol, and stared at Daniel Hayes's name written across the front. Charles did not open it. He already knew what was inside. He quietly returned it to the drawer, locked it, and slipped the key into his pocket. Then his phone lit up with a security notification. Daniel Hayes had entered the building. Daniel stepped through the employee entrance at 7:12 the next morning, carrying the same battered toolbox and wearing the same brown canvas jacket. Nothing about him suggested urgency, yet Charles Grant was already watching his security badge move across a monitor 42 floors above. "Why is Hayes here?" Charles asked. His assistant glanced at the maintenance schedule. Executive presentation system. Engineering requested him yesterday. Cancel the request. Sir, the investor demonstration starts at 9. Charles looked toward Richard Whitmore's locked office. Then find somebody else. Downstairs, Daniel entered the main equipment room and immediately heard something wrong. The cooling fans hummed steadily. Status lights blinked green. Everything looked normal. Too normal. He opened the primary diagnostic panel and studied the numbers. One reading drifted by less than 2%. Another repeated every 47 seconds. A third should not have been there at all. Daniel became still. "Morning." Emily's voice came from behind him. Daniel turned. She wore a navy business suit, her blonde hair pulled neatly back, her expression more controlled than yesterday. "I came to make sure there are no surprises." "There will be." Emily frowned. "Excuse me." Daniel pointed toward the diagnostic display. "Your presentation network is going to fail." "When?" He checked his watch. 11 minutes. Emily stared at him. "That specific?" "Yes." Charles entered before she could respond. "We have 3 senior engineers upstairs who ran diagnostics 30 minutes ago. Everything passed." Daniel closed the panel. "They tested the surface system." Charles smiled faintly. "And you found something they missed?" "Yes." "Of course you did." Emily exhaled. Yesterday's embarrassment still lingered between them, especially the initials on Daniel's brass key and the way he had spoken about her father. She wanted answers, but not now. Investors representing a potential $400 million partnership were already arriving. "Can you prevent it?" she asked. "If I shut down the presentation network now?" Charles immediately shook his head. "Absolutely not. We have guests upstairs." Daniel looked at Emily. 11 minutes becomes 10 in about 5 seconds. "Daniel," she said carefully, "if we shut everything down because of a reading only you can see, we jeopardize this meeting before it begins. If you do not, the system will do it for you." Charles laughed softly. There it is again. The mysterious maintenance man who knows more than everyone in the building. Daniel did not answer the insult. He simply looked at the clock mounted above the door. 10 minutes, 52 seconds. Emily chose the meeting. Upstairs, coffee cups settled onto polished tables as investors opened leather portfolios. The giant display illuminated the Whitmore logo. Charles began his introduction. Daniel remained near the rear wall, permitted to stay only because Emily wanted technical support nearby. 8 minutes. The demonstration began perfectly. 6 minutes. Charts moved smoothly across the screen. For minutes. Charles glanced toward Daniel with a satisfied smile. 2 minutes. Emily began presenting the company's newest platform. Daniel watched a tiny amber indicator appear at the bottom of the control console. "Emily," he said quietly. Charles turned. "Not now. You have 40 seconds." Emily hesitated. 30. Charles continued speaking. 20. The amber light became red. Emily finally looked at Daniel. He was not smiling. He was not enjoying being right. That unsettled her more than anything. 10, he said. 9. 8. Charles stopped talking. 7. 6. 5. The room slowly fell silent. 4. 3. 2. At 0, every screen went black. The ventilation hum remained. Coffee steamed untouched. No one moved. Then, in the darkness of the dead display, Daniel's voice came quietly from the back of the room. "Now you have a much bigger problem." For 3 seconds, nobody moved. The black display reflected 12 executives, 6 investors, and 1 maintenance technician standing near the rear wall in a worn brown jacket. Then the room erupted with questions. What happened? Can we restore it? How long will this take? Charles raised both hands. Everyone remained calm. Our engineering team will handle this. Daniel quietly crossed the room and stopped beside the control console. Emily watched him. There was no satisfaction in his face, no trace of a man enjoying another person's embarrassment. He had warned them. They had ignored him. Now he was simply studying the problem. Daniel, Emily said. Charles immediately cut in. We do not need him. Your senior engineers said the system was healthy 11 minutes ago. Her voice was colder now. Charles went silent. Emily turned back to Daniel. Can you fix it? Daniel looked at the blank screen. Maybe. First I need 3 answers. Was the legacy synchronization layer removed during last year's upgrade? The lead engineer blinked. No. Was the original routing protocol rewritten? Partially. Who authorized the bridge between the old architecture and the new platform? Nobody answered. Daniel nodded once. That is the problem. He removed his jacket, folded it carefully over a chair, and opened his toolbox. Underneath, he wore a plain gray work shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms. His hands moved across the console without hesitation. He did not search menus like someone discovering them. He moved through them like someone remembering a road home. The lead engineer stepped closer. That directory is not in our documentation. It predates your documentation. Daniel entered a sequence of commands. A hidden diagnostic layer appeared. Rows of old system architecture filled the secondary monitor. One engineer whispered, I have never seen that interface. Daniel pointed to 3 lines. Here, and here. The new platform keeps asking the legacy core for permission it no longer knows how to give. Emily stood beside him. How do you know that? Daniel did not answer immediately. The room had grown strangely quiet. Even the investors were watching now. He rerouted one process, isolated another, then restored the original synchronization pathway. The conference screen flickered. Once, twice. Then the Whitmore logo returned. A green status bar moved steadily across the bottom. 100%. The room remained silent for another beat before relieved voices began murmuring. Charles stepped forward. Lucky diagnosis. Daniel closed the console. No, Charles gave a thin smile. Then perhaps you would like to explain how a contract maintenance technician knows proprietary architecture better than the engineers responsible for it. Emily looked directly at Daniel. I would. Daniel's gaze moved toward the silver Whitmore logo. For a moment, he saw another version of it painted crookedly on a garage wall, with Richard standing underneath it holding 2 cups of terrible coffee. Because I built it, Daniel said. Silence returned, deeper this time. Emily stared at him. You built what? The original architecture. Charles laughed, but nobody joined him. That is absurd. Daniel calmly put a screwdriver back into his toolbox. Then check revision 0. The lead engineer turned toward his laptop. His fingers moved quickly. He stopped. Revision 0 is restricted. Charles's expression changed for barely a second. Daniel noticed. Who has access? Emily asked. The engineer swallowed. Executive authorization only. Charles recovered his smile. Old prototypes prove nothing. Even if Mr. Hayes contributed years ago, that does not make him important now. Daniel lifted his jacket from the chair. I never said it did. He started toward the door. Emily followed him with her eyes. Daniel. He stopped. Yesterday you said my father did not care what you wore. Today you say you built his original system. What exactly were you to him? Daniel looked at her, then at Charles. That is a question you should ask the people who kept the answer from you. Charles went pale. Daniel walked out, leaving the room silent behind him. Emily waited until the investors had been escorted to a private lounge before she locked the boardroom doors. Revision 0, she said. Open it. The lead engineer shifted uneasily behind his laptop. I cannot. The archive requires founder-level authorization. My authorization does not qualify. Charles folded his arms. Emily, this is becoming a distraction. She turned toward him. A maintenance technician just repaired a system my entire engineering division could not diagnose, predicted its failure to the second, and claimed he built its foundation with my father. I think distraction is the wrong word. Charles's jaw tightened. Daniel Hayes was a junior engineer years ago. Nothing more. Emily heard the certainty in his voice. Too much certainty. You knew his name. Charles paused. Personnel records. Before anyone checked them, silence settled between them. Emily picked up her tablet and left. 20 minutes later, she stood inside the company archive 3 floors below the lobby, where fluorescent lights hummed above shelves of forgotten binders, prototype components, and storage boxes carrying dates from another life. An elderly records manager named Harold Pierce met her at the door. He had worked for Richard before Whitmore Technologies had an executive cafeteria. "I need everything from the first 3 years," Emily said, "especially anything connected to Daniel Hayes." Harold stopped walking. "Daniel came back?" Emily studied him. "You know him too?" Harold gave her a sad smile. "Miss Whitmore, everyone who was here at the beginning knew Daniel." The first box contained photographs. Richard and Daniel beside a folding table. Richard and Daniel sleeping in office chairs after an overnight test. Richard holding a handwritten contract while Daniel stood beside the first successful prototype in that same worn brown jacket. Emily stared at it. "He still wears this." Harold nodded. "Your father bought him a new one after their first major contract." Daniel returned it. "Why?" Said the old one still worked. For the first time, Emily felt the cruelty of yesterday's laughter differently. She had mocked an object her father had once understood. The second box contained patent drafts. Daniel Hayes appeared beside Richard Whitmore again and again. The third contained correspondence. One email stopped her completely. Richard had written, "Daniel does not work for me. He builds beside me." If Whitmore ever forgets that distinction, then Whitmore has forgotten itself. Emily lowered herself into a chair. Why was none of this in the corporate history? Harold looked toward the archive door. "That is a question for someone above my pay grade." Then he remembered something. "There is one more thing." From a locked cabinet, he removed an old digital recorder labeled Personal Archive, Richard Whitmore. Emily pressed play. Static whispered through the tiny speaker before her father's voice filled the room. Older, tired, familiar enough to make her breath catch. If Emily ever hears this, then I probably ran out of time. She covered her mouth. There are people who will tell her I built Whitmore alone. That is convenient. It is also a lie. Daniel Hayes was there when this company was nothing but debt, bad coffee, and an idea nobody believed in. He built it beside me. Emily closed her eyes as tears gathered quietly. Her father continued. Daniel never asked for recognition. That is exactly why he deserved it. The recording clicked, but did not end. Richard's voice dropped lower. And if Charles Grant is still with the company when this is found, do not let him see the sealed letter until Daniel uses the brass key. Emily's eyes opened. Harold stared at her. Neither spoke. Across the building, inside Richard's preserved office, Charles opened the locked drawer again. The envelope bearing Daniel's name was gone. Charles Grant stared into the empty drawer as if the missing envelope had somehow accused him. He checked beneath the folders, behind the old ledgers, even inside the false bottom Richard had installed years ago. Nothing. For the first time that morning, Charles stopped looking confident. Across town, Daniel sat in his pickup outside Mia's elementary school, waiting for dismissal, when Emily called. "I need to see you." Daniel watched children gathering near the front doors. "I am picking up my daughter." Then after, "Emily, whatever this is, it can wait." Her voice softened. "My father left a recording about you." Daniel's hand tightened around the phone. "What did he say?" "Enough to make me realize I owe you an apology. And enough to know Charles has been lying." Daniel looked through the windshield for a long moment. "I will come in at 6. "Thank you." "Do not thank me yet." At 6:11, Daniel entered Richard's preserved office for the first time in 12 years. Dustless shelves held the same engineering books. The old brass desk lamp remained near the window. Even Richard's wooden model airplane still sat beside a photograph of Emily as a child. Daniel stopped at the threshold. Some rooms did not preserve objects. They preserved time. Emily stood beside the desk, holding the recorder. "I heard his voice today." Daniel nodded quietly. "I am sorry. You knew him better than I did near the end, did you not?" "Different parts of him." Emily swallowed. "Why did you disappear?" Daniel looked toward the Chicago skyline. "My wife needed me. Then my daughter needed me. By the time I was ready to return, Richard was gone and Whitmore had become something I barely recognized." Emily lowered her eyes. "Including me." Daniel did not rescue her from the truth. That silence carried more grace than an easy lie. She placed the recorder on the desk. "He mentioned your brass key." Daniel slowly pulled the leather cord from beneath his shirt. Emily pointed toward a narrow walnut cabinet built into the wall. Harold says nobody has opened that cabinet since my father died. Daniel approached it. The brass key slid perfectly into a small lock hidden beneath the trim. Click. Inside sat no money, no stock certificates, no dramatic treasure. Only a black archival box. Daniel lifted the lid. It was empty except for a cream-colored card bearing Richard's handwriting. 3 words were written across it. Find the original. Emily frowned. The original what? Daniel stared at the card. Then he understood. The founding agreement. Charles appeared in the doorway. There was no founding agreement. Daniel turned slowly. Interesting. Charles remained still. What? I never said what kind of agreement we were looking for. Emily's expression hardened. Charles recovered quickly. This is ridiculous. Your father incorporated the company himself. After Daniel helped build it, Emily said. Contribution is not ownership. Daniel watched Charles carefully. You are afraid of a document you claim never existed. The room became quiet. Charles finally sighed. Fine. Richard made promises when the company was small. Sentimental promises. But businesses grow up. People should too, Daniel said. Charles ignored him and looked at Emily. Tomorrow the board votes on the acquisition. If you delay it over ancient paperwork, you risk your position as chief executive officer. Emily went pale. You arranged the vote? I protected the company. Daniel understood then. Charles did not merely want the past forgotten. He needed the sale completed before the past could speak. Emily, Daniel said, you do not owe me your job. She looked at him. And you do not owe this company anything. Maybe not. Daniel picked up his jacket. Then why did you come back? He paused beside Richard's photograph. Because your father believed a company could have a conscience. Charles gave a dismissive laugh. Daniel opened the door. I will not fight you for Whitmore. I will not fight Emily for it either. Then he glanced at the empty black box. But somebody already found the original before we did. Emily's face changed. Daniel looked toward Charles. And I think Richard planned for that. The board vote began at 9 the next morning beneath the same cold lights where Daniel had been laughed at 2 days earlier. This time, nobody laughed when he entered. He wore the same faded brown jacket, the same scuffed boots, and carried no briefcase. Emily stood at the head of the table, her blonde hair neatly pulled back, but something in her expression had changed. Charles sat 3 seats away beside a stack of acquisition documents. Before we vote, Emily said, there is unfinished business. Charles leaned back. There is always unfinished business when sentiment enters a boardroom. Daniel remained near the door. Then leave sentiment out of it. Charles smiled. Gladly. You were an engineer. A talented one, perhaps. You walked away. 12 years later you return in work clothes, and suddenly everyone is supposed to treat you like a founder. Daniel looked down at his jacket. The jacket seems important to you. A few directors shifted uncomfortably. Appearances communicate judgment, Charles replied. No, Daniel said quietly. Choices do. Emily placed an old photograph on the table. Richard and Daniel stood inside the garage, exhausted, smiling, the first prototype between them. Beside it she placed patent drafts, early correspondence, and Richard's recorder. My father communicated his judgment very clearly. Charles shook his head. None of that changes ownership. You are right, Emily said. It does not. The boardroom doors opened. Harold Pierce entered carrying a weathered document case. Charles's face lost its color. Harold placed it before Emily. Richard gave this to me 11 years ago with instructions that seemed ridiculous at the time. He said I was to release it only if 3 things happened. Daniel returned. The brass key opened the cabinet, and someone tried to sell controlling interest outside the company. Daniel stared at him. Even he had not known. Emily opened the case. Inside rested the original founding agreement, notarized amendments, and a sealed letter. Charles stood. Those documents require legal review. They already received it, Emily said. Independent counsel verified them at 7:30 this morning. Silence. She turned 1 page toward the board. Richard had formally preserved Daniel's founding interest through a protected voting trust. It was not enough to take the company from Emily. Richard had never intended that. But on any sale transferring control outside Whitmore, Daniel's dormant voting rights activated. The acquisition could not proceed without him. Charles looked at Daniel. So this was your plan? Daniel almost seemed disappointed by the question. I did not know this existed. Convenient. Truth usually is inconvenient to the person hiding from it. Charles looked around the table. This man abandoned the company. Daniel could have answered with anger. He could have described hospital rooms, sleepless nights, his wife's illness, and the little girl who needed a father more than Whitmore needed another executive. Instead, he said only, "I chose my family." Charles scoffed. "And now you can choose revenge." Daniel walked to the table. He placed both hands lightly on the back of an empty chair. "No," Charles blinked. "I am not here to take your office. I am not here to embarrass anyone. I came back because Richard would have hated what this place became." Nobody moved. Daniel looked around the room. "We built Whitmore believing good technology should solve real problems, and good leadership should respect the people solving them. Somewhere along the way, titles became more important than character." Emily lowered her eyes. Then she stood. "Including to me." She looked directly at Daniel. "I judged the man my father trusted most by the clothes he wore. I was wrong." Daniel gave a small nod. No triumph, just grace. Emily turned to the board. "I vote against the acquisition." One hand rose. Then another. Then another. Charles stared at the unsigned sale documents before him as the final vote was recorded. The deal was over. Daniel could have smiled. He did not. He simply picked up Richard's sealed letter. On the front, beneath Daniel's name, Richard had written one additional line that nobody had noticed until now. "Give this to Mia when she is old enough to understand why her father walked away." 3 months later, the lobby of Whitmore Technologies looked exactly as it always had. Morning sunlight poured through 40 feet of glass. Shoes clicked across polished stone. Elevators chimed. Coffee machines hummed behind the reception desk. Yet something inside the company had changed. Charles Grant had resigned after an independent review uncovered his efforts to conceal historical records connected to the proposed acquisition. Emily remained chief executive officer, but the title no longer seemed to enter a room before she did. She spent more time on the engineering floor, learned the names of maintenance workers, and replaced the executive-only parking spaces with employee recognition spots. Daniel accepted his restored founding interest, but refused the corner office waiting upstairs. Instead, he became a technical advisor 3 days a week, leaving every afternoon before 3:30 so he could pick Mia up from school. He still drove the old dark blue pickup. He still carried the battered toolbox. And he still wore the brown canvas jacket. One Friday afternoon, Emily found him near the original prototype now displayed in the lobby. Mia stood beside him, reading the small plaque beneath it. "They spelled your name right," she said. Daniel smiled. "High standards." Emily laughed softly. "You are really never throwing that jacket away, are you?" Daniel looked at the faded sleeve. "Your father hated this jacket too." Emily shook her head. "No, I think he understood what was inside it before I did." Daniel looked at her. There was no boardroom tension now, only something warmer built slowly from apology, respect, and the possibility of a second chance neither of them needed to name yet. Mia tugged Daniel's hand. "Can we open Mr. Whitmore's letter tonight?" Daniel's smile disappeared. The sealed envelope had remained untouched for 3 months. Richard had written that it belonged to Mia when she was old enough to understand why her father walked away. Daniel had decided 8 was too young. Emily glanced at him. Maybe Richard knew better. That evening, the 3 of them sat around Daniel's kitchen table. Rain tapped softly against the window. Tomato soup warmed on the stove, and Richard's envelope rested beneath the yellow kitchen light. Daniel finally handed it to Mia. "You open it." She carefully broke the seal. Inside was a letter and a photograph. Mia unfolded the letter first. Richard's words were simple. He wrote that companies measured value in dollars because dollars were easy to count, but a person's true value was measured by what he refused to sacrifice. Daniel had walked away from wealth, recognition, and power because his wife and daughter needed him. Richard called that the best decision either founder had ever made. Daniel lowered his eyes. Emily quietly wiped away a tear. Mia turned the page. "There is more." Richard explained that Daniel's protected voting trust had never been designed merely to preserve his ownership. It had been designed to protect something else until Mia was ready. Daniel frowned. "What does that mean?" Mia pulled the photograph from the envelope. It showed Richard and Daniel in the old garage, but behind them stood a third person Daniel had forgotten was present that day. Daniel's late wife, holding the first prototype circuit board and smiling toward the camera. Emily leaned closer. On the back, Richard had written another message. Daniel read it once. Then again. His breath caught. The original core architecture had not been Daniel's alone. His wife had designed the synchronization principle that made it possible, but she had refused public credit while helping Daniel care for her during her illness. Richard had preserved her contribution separately. The trust Daniel thought belonged to him had always contained a second protected share. It belonged to Mia, not as charity, not as inheritance from Richard, as recognition of her mother's work. Mia stared at her father. Mom helped build Whitmore too. Daniel could not answer immediately. For years, he had believed Richard's final promise was about protecting his place in the company. He had been wrong. Richard had been protecting her place in history. Daniel reached across the table and took his daughter's hand. Emily sat quietly beside them as rain whispered against the glass. In the end, the greatest thing Richard Whitmore had preserved was not a company, a fortune, or even a founder's name. It was the truth that dignity does not become valuable when the world finally recognizes it. It was valuable all along.